Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today we're going to be talking with a veteran journalist who's been covering the United Nations and international issues for 24 plus years. Richard Roth is the senior correspondent for CNN. Mr. Roth has covered everything from the Arab Spring to the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, as well as other issues such as the Arab uprising and a variety of others. Today we're going to get his keen perspective on these international issues and the role that the United Nations plays. Richard Roth, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you, Bill. Nice to be here.
Well, thank you. I think we're both battling colds at the same time. Battling colds. Well, good to see you. Richard, let's talk about this. You've had a very varied career covering these international issues. And let's start talking a little bit about the institution of the United Nations. It's the only international organization that brings all the countries of the world, so to speak, together under one roof. That's an institution that's been here since 1945. You're a mini institution with CNN. You've been here at least 24 years covering it. How has the UN changed over the years? What have you seen as far as some of the major changes?
Well, I didn't have gray hair when I started. The use of the word institution when it comes to the UN or myself, very appropriate in many different ways. Look, there's been change, but I think for a lot of people who try to watch the UN or think of the UN, they probably would say there's no change in terms of productivity. A lot of material and a lot of promise you really don't observe. And of course the news media, we tend to focus on all the bad stories. They are important and significant. I think we've seen ups and downs. In the 90s, after the end of the Cold War, we saw a lot of 15-0 unanimous votes in the Security Council. There was less division then. It might have been a small window of opportunity, and some things were accomplished in that period. But these days, as you know very well, you see big power divisions. The UN is trying, perhaps with the pressure from Washington, to once again reform or change itself. Some would say that the problems of the UN are endemic in the system. I mean, if you had a private company with 193 board members trying to decide things, you've got a recipe for disaster. So there has been a lot of change, but unfortunately, due to the nature of the issues facing the UN, which we may want to follow up on, they're different than post-World War II when the UN was established.
That's very, very true. And of course, the UN came out of the rubble of World War II, the devastation of World War II. And as you mentioned, the Security Council, which is the most powerful organ of the UN, basically, it was the former Soviet Union and the U.S. They fought the Cold War at the Security Council, and very little was accomplished. And then in 89, 90, 91, things started to change. You mentioned also about the UN leadership and that type of thing. You have the Secretary General, and Trygve Lie, the first Secretary General, told Dag Hammarskjöld, the second Secretary General, that being SG is the most difficult job in the world. Is that accurate? Do you think that's pretty close to what the case is?
And I think they also used to say being mayor of New York City was the world's most impossible job. And also, I think Trygve Lie thought the job of General Assembly President would be more prestigious, and he wanted that job, not necessarily Secretary General. And I guess he found out, yes, it was the leading job. I would say it's, if you're speaking on a global nature, yes, I'd say it's the world's most troublesome plague job. I mean, I'm sure the current Secretary General gets phone calls at all hours or on issues. I mean, how many people can you placate in an hour or ask them to get their troops out of a certain country, or please don't harm these refugees, or would you mind defusing your nuclear device? I mean, that's probably just in the morning. So yes, I think the Secretary General has one of the toughest jobs around. And if he wants, he can have 2 5-year terms if he wants all of that trouble.
Mm-hmm. Now, you started covering the UN full-time back in 1993, as I recall. You covered a lot of Secretaries General. How did they evolve over the years, and are there any interesting insights you could share about any of them?
You know, just the other day, Bill, I strolled through the lobby inside UN headquarters, and they had the portraits of all the Secretaries General, and I realized I've talked to all of them except 3. I did interview Kurt Waldheim over the phone, where he defended himself against accusations he was a member of the Nazi unit. That I would say that distinguishes him from other Secretaries General. And then you had Javier Pérez de Cuellar, very nice man. I covered him sporadically in the early days of CNN, and covered him in Jordan when they were trying to get the hostages out of Baghdad, American hostages. And of course, Boutros Boutros-Ghali, a man who liked to be in control of things, didn't get along with the U.S. Ambassador, Madeleine Albright, who then cost him a second term. Kofi Annan, I'd say, was the best period for being a television journalist. We could discuss that. And then you had Ban Ki-moon, who did not make himself that available to the media, may have accomplished more behind the scenes, but we may never know until later what was accomplished. And then you have Antonio Guterres of Portugal currently. So they're all different, but the trend, sadly, seems to be less contact with the media, work behind the scenes, let the big powers, the people that voted the Secretary General into office, let them make the major decisions and don't mess with us here at the if you tried to from the UN. They don't want a more proactive Secretary General, which they feel Kofi Annan was.
And when the UN was formed in 1945, it was really so many of the issues they're dealing with today, Ebola, North Korea may have been around at that time, but some of the other problems were not what climate change. We weren't even talking about those issues. So these issues have really been put on the agenda of the United Nations, has expanded their mandate and the problems they're dealing with today.
Yes, and on the grounds of where we're being taping this interview was a slaughterhouse, so that may have been a good omen for the future of the UN. You know, the issues, the difference I think was that it was set up that they never foresaw. They set it up for country A attacking country B, and country B then reinvading country A, and then they had to settle that. And now, as we know, dozens, hundreds of different types of wars, especially terrorism, or a country imploding from within, a government abusing its own citizens. It was not really thought of that would be high on the agenda when they were meeting in San Francisco or London and getting the UN off the ground. So these are very important issues, but you could say that the UN is not set up to deal with them because they're so vast, and the interests of countries, they seem to avoid the UN at times and work bilaterally or with the European Union, and linking up with the Asian countries. The UN, critics say, has turned into more of a talk shop. Then it's needed when you least expect it. You know, for a television journalist, it's very hard sometimes to cover these issues because it's usually talking here. The real story is out in the field with a polio worker in Pakistan or a human rights official in Myanmar, that kind of thing.
It certainly would be. It'd be very difficult. When you were talking about that, how it's a talk shop to a large degree, and you do have frontline workers. You have the High Commission for Human Rights, High Commission for Refugees, UNICEF, different agencies like that that are in harm's way every day, the World Food Program, different groups that are right on the ground in war zones. But when you're talking about it, it brought back to mind the saying of Sir Winston Churchill, who said, it's better to talk or jaw than war. So I guess there's a place for that at the UN.
The common expression is if the UN didn't exist, you'd have to create it. I mean, we don't know how many world wars or one world war has been prevented. But it hasn't stopped, sadly, so much carnage elsewhere, whether it was Cambodia decades ago, what happened in Rwanda, Srebrenica. Even when the UN has good intentions, it can't always succeed. It seems that it would work better if there was good diplomats backed by possibly force with the threat of big power countries all on the same page. But that's sort of a pipe dream at the moment.
And that would be the role of the Security Council.
Yes, the Security Council, which has 5 permanent members, for those of you watching, unless they've changed it, but they've been working on it for over 25 years. And a diplomat the other day said, just starting out as an ambassador, said, I don't see Security Council reform or changes taking place while he's here. So that'll be over 35 years, I think, of no change. But everybody wants to be on the Security Council, except Saudi Arabia, which was voted a 2-year term and then refused at the last minute for a variety of reasons. Yes, the Security Council at the beginning was not thought of to be the place in the UN, but for the media, for television, it is the place. The war, violence, sanctions, that gets people going, and people around the world in newsrooms want to know about the Security Council. Less so, sadly, the General Assembly, despite every country having a vote there and it taking up a lot of issues. It's lost its clout, unfortunately.
As you look at the United Nations over the past several years and where we've come, and you worked with these Secretaries General, you mentioned a minute ago, before I get off that Kofi Annan was one of the most coverable Secretaries General. Why was that?
I think each side needed each other. It happened at a very good moment for me personally. I took up the UN post in '93. And then a few years later, Kofi Annan started as the Secretary General. He had been a director of peacekeeping, so he worked in the building, unlike the last two Secretary Generals. And he was soft-spoken, but he had some very clever communications people with him. CNN was one of the only television people there, and at the time I was fortunate to be able to have a half-hour program based on the UN. This was unheard of in those days, an international program using video. We tried to jazz it up a bit, covering the UN every week. These days I don't think we'd have enough video material to fill up a half hour, but those days Kofi Annan would come in the front door. This was pre-9/11 and prior to additional security measures, and he would stop, and myself and other print journalists would get 5 or 6 quick questions. And my network at the time, the international channel, even the USA channel, would take live reports from me. And the way Kofi Annan was able to say very little but say something in his answer, it was a real art. Now everybody is so cautious, even ambassadors, to not appear on camera. Especially with the internet, it seems nobody wants to have every word spoken at a microphone. They're worried about their boss back home, their prime minister saying, "What did you say?" Or, "I don't want that person to be the star in New York." I know we're veering off here, but the UN is different than many other hotspots around the world because there are 70 to 300 journalists who could be in the building at any time. You don't find that elsewhere. We also have tremendous access, much more than you would at the Pentagon or some other foreign ministry around the world. So it's very tempting. You can get very close and personal, as they used to say in live television, up close and personal with a diplomat. And even if you don't get him or her on camera, you can get some words which will suddenly appear on a wire service around the world. So Kofi Annan hit the right spot. Look, they hit a good patch. He won the peacekeeping, the Nobel Peace Prize. The peacekeepers, I think, won. Didn't have the greatest last few years as things turned on him regarding the Oil for Food program. But the Annan years are remembered fondly, I think, by many journalists for access and news. I think the UN in those days felt comfortable with delivering comments, results. Now they tend to lay back, I think.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We would invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Global Connections Television is provided free of charge at no cost. And again, we do this so that we can help people better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today, we're going to be talking with Richard Roth, who is the face of CNN, has been really since 1993, covering the United Nations and other major international issues. Richard is a veteran journalist. He covered the Arab uprising, the Afghanistan and Iraq wars. Also, he was involved in many other areas of the world. But Richard, I want to welcome you back to our program. And we've got so many items to touch upon right now that I'd like to get back to. But before we get off of the UN and move into some of your personal experience, let's do that right now. Let's go into that. Are there any, you mentioned Kofi Annan and some of the other secretaries general as far as memorable people you met at the UN. Were there any others that come to mind immediately, or interesting, memorable events that took place within this building?
All right, you can take the rest of the show off with
okay,
this answer.
Well, I'll be back.
And after that big introduction, I thought I should ask for a raise. I mean, believe me, they don't want me to be the face of CNN. They might take another body part. Anyway, what are the? There have been great moments, at least for me, and if we had a camera, even better. A lot of people came through the UN in the last 20, 30 years, and some the notorious, some the famous, some rose to fame. I just have these memories that I'm sure are located in the bowels and libraries of United Nations Television. Whether it was the Iraqi delegation prior to the war, whether Tariq Aziz, who has since died, one of the major spokesmen for Saddam Hussein, coming, and you'd listen to every word they would say. Would they give up their weapons, which it turns out they really didn't have. You had high-stakes diplomacy occurring on his visits. When the Security Council met to consider a resolution to go to war, which the U.S. wanted, France and the rest didn't. And when that moment came, right days after George Bush said, let's see some hands in the air there at the Security Council, in other words, pushing for a vote in favor of a resolution. And that day when they said they didn't have it, I think it was Ambassador Negroponte of the U.S. and Ambassador Greenstock of the U.K., and they decided not to go to a vote. I mean, you could hear the roars in the building. And then there have been many famous goodwill ambassadors, messengers of peace. I remember Pierce Brosnan when he was playing James Bond, walking into the building, going up in an elevator to see the Secretary General. But because of the movie he had out at the time, I think I yelled out to him, "What, the world is not enough, sir?" And he had to come here. And he had a bit of a wry smile. The days we interviewed George Clooney, Maria Sharapova, the tennis player, I offered her chocolates because she liked chocolate. I mean, all of them. Naomi Watts, Angelina Jolie. I remember coming out of I was dressing for a dinner that she was going to be at in my tuxedo. How many people get to be told? I walked out of my office. She said, "Wow, you look nice." And it's, you have to say, "Is that Angelina Jolie sitting there telling me that?" I don't know why I remember that.
What a compliment.
So I said, "Listen, just read the prompter." I told her. No. What else? There have been even disgraced arms inspectors being chased through the lobby. There was a very big day in August of 2002 when Hans Blix was briefing the Security Council about Iraq and what the weapons situation was. And I was in the live chair to go live to the camera. I finished my live report, got up, started walking to my desk, and you heard to my left, pop, pop, pop. And I recognized those as gunshots. And as I'm walking to my desk, I look to the left into the UN driveway where the fountain is, right near First Avenue, and I saw a man being wrestled to the ground, and he had thrown leaflets in the air. He was a angry Korean postal worker, and the Secret Service happened to be on the grounds because of the visit of the Cyprus president, and they rushed over. Otherwise, I'm not sure what would have happened. The bullets went 2 or 3 floors above the CNN, no, actually 14 or 15 floors higher, but they pierced the building. And we had our camera that was able to take it live, and I was on the phone describing it. And you only get that by being here every day. And since then, yes, they've tightened security a lot.
Mm-hmm. Exactly, which is fortunate. The polls show that Americans in particular, possibly people overseas, are getting better information, or more information, I should say, about UN agencies because they're more directly impacted at times. But the polls show that Americans generally support the UN anywhere from about 42% of the time to about 85% of the time, depending upon the issues. But the polls also show that we do not understand the United Nations. Do we not need more programs like the one that you had years ago, plug for Global Connections Television, other shows pointing out what UN agencies do, but not just UN agencies, but what's going on internationally and why we should learn more about these issues?
Well, you might be surprised. My answer is yes, but this audience has changed. Not the audience watching now, please don't turn off. I'm talking about to get more eyeballs. It's very difficult for, as you know, for any news agency now. People are in this race to clicks, I forget what the phrase, clicks for kick, whatever, getting clickbait. People seem to have good intentions. I'll bet if I lined up 100 people in a room on the internet and they started reading an article about UN climate change proposals, and then suddenly up on the right would say, here's the latest picture of Britney Spears, I want to see how many of those 100 people keep following. It's very difficult. Also, the UN from here, it's not very visual, and that's been the tricky part if you're a television journalist. Do I think some type of rich person would be we would love to have sponsor travel and field work? Yes, I think there's a global show that can be done. I know Angelina Jolie has done movies, Beyond Borders, things like that. The UN, unfortunately, does not have its own army, military army or public relations army, and sometimes it pulls back and nobody knows who the Secretary General is. Nobody knows and sometimes doesn't care. They don't understand the connection. They don't understand how a good peacekeeping team could perhaps stop an eventual wider war where the U.S. would have to put more money in. But the UN is made up of only those members, and sometimes I don't like it when people blame the UN, but they should single out countries. But nobody wakes up in the morning on election day, that's the problem, and on the top 20 ideas is, honey, I'm really concerned about the UN, I'm going to vote for this candidate. It just doesn't come up. Now, you remember Bob Dole, Republican convention. When you look back, it's kind of shocking, making fun of the pronunciation of Boutros Ghali and getting the Republican to boo or yell or laugh. And, that was a name. Now, you could criticize his accomplishments or his diplomatic style, but people knew Boutros Ghali. It helped that Jerry Seinfeld used a Boutros Ghali joke in the episode in the Hamptons. Check it out, look it up, regarding Ambassador George Costanza. But the UN itself has a lot of agencies who have public relations people. My big frustration is you have 40 to 1,000 of these people. There's no connection with all of them. UNICEF just cares about UNICEF. You know, World Food cares just about World Food. Everybody's got their own fiefdoms and PR outfits, and they could care less that you might have a big story on Bosnia that day. They'll still send you their press release or their symposium with the same 4 people that are appearing 2 hours later at another agency. So the UN needs a big media czar and a media operation. The UN is in the media capital of the world. I've said this for decades. Show me the morning program that would have the hosting of the show done from the UN. You've got to be able to convince them to do it. I mean, it's a big sell, but you can do it, I think.
And of course, the UN, I don't work for the UN, but the UN does have a lot of videos out there. They have the Department of Public Information puts out the information, and our viewers can go to un.org.
Now, UN.org is very impressive. It's better and better.
Exactly.
I agree with you. I'm living maybe a bit in the past, but every time I go on there, I see, okay, and you can watch meetings live. And you can,
that's right.
You know, but I don't know how you get that Nebraska resident, that California student to click and stay with it.
You know, that's a very good point. You can go to un.org, go to the bottom of the page. If you tap into English, go to the bottom and go to the spokesperson and watch the noon briefing, which you attend quite frequently. And it's live from 12 to 12:45 or whatever it might be. And that's one good way to learn much more about these international issues.
No, I agree. I still think more can be done, but you need that strong personality at the top. And while I never criticize Secretary General, if that person is not visible, in my opinion, and yes, I'm biased as a media person, the whole institution sinks without that person. That he or she in the future may not want to be very public, and yes, diplomacy is best conducted behind closed doors, but this is a different age now. You've got to be out there. I don't care if you're riding a skateboard. You have to be representing all of the thousands of UN staff and workers and getting some kind of message and throwing a few bones to the media, which is sitting here hungry.
Exactly. And you have to be visible. You have to be highly visible. The polls showed, I remember back after Kofi Annan had left as Secretary General several years into Ban Ki-moon, a lot of Americans thought Kofi Annan was still Secretary General of the United Nations.
Look, I went out onto a street corner, a good street corner, where people were wearing clothes, at the end of the 10 years of Ban Ki-moon. And I had been waiting 10 years to ask this question. And I asked a variety of global people who looked like they had some brains. And I asked, who is the current Secretary General of the UN? Out of the 40 people I asked, only 2 knew who he was, and one of them was a South Korean.
Really?
I have the video.
That is frightening. That is frightening. It really is.
They weren't just from America either.
No. Well, in our last 30 seconds, and that's all we have.
Really?
We'll have to, I'm sorry. We'll do another one, I promise. Our last 30 seconds.
We barely got past Angola to get to Zimbabwe. All right,
we never got to the Arab uprising and the Iraq and other places. We'll do it again. In the last 30 seconds, do you have a parting comment as to how we can learn more about these issues?
Well, you've got to have some interest, but everybody should be reading an international section, a global section of online, television, websites of NGOs, to really care and get all sides. Not every issue is so easy as let's send in missiles or let's send in troops. There's it's a big world, of course, and now it's really buyer beware and do your own work, or you're not going to be informed. I remember the day I was shocked when Saddam invaded Kuwait. I don't think I was studying that issue that well. I was a general assignment reporter then. So the UN could also do a better job. It's hard to lead a diplomat to water, but you need outreach.
Especially when you have a board of directors of 193. But Richard Roth with CNN, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you for having me.
And we'll battle our colds together.
Okay.
I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.